Many of you who are watching are not yet subscribed. Subscribe now, and you can change your mind later.
Most criminals unintentionally leave evidence behind, evidence that can condemn. But sometimes the proof is worthless. When even the latest technology can't finger a killer, all detectives can do is wait until science catches up. It was the morning of January 22nd, 1988, when Texas Rangers were summoned to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County. They'd been called to check up on an elderly woman who lived by herself. Neighbors couldn't reach her on the phone. There was concern that something might have happened. They were right. 72-year-old Lydia Schumacher had been murdered. Inside, Rangers discovered the gruesome scene. Schumacher lay partially nude on her bed. The sheets were bloody. She'd been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin was called in to process the house for evidence. Someone had clearly broken in the back door, and it seemed some jewelry was missing. Apparently, Mrs. Schumacher had surprised a burglar. There were no fingerprints to be collected, and the weapon used to beat her couldn't be found. It was likely that she was smothered with her own pillow. Officers turned their attention to the body and the bed. Serologist Donna Stanley, an expert in biological evidence, examined the crime scene and found signs that the victim had been raped.
So what we then did was we began to unravel the bed sheet by sheet. And from doing that, we covered any hair that we saw on the sheets and the bedspread. That was where it became apparent at that moment that we might have been dealing more with more than just with a homicide, that we might have had a sexual assault involved.
To track down the killer, Rangers began interviewing people in the area for any information. Within a week, Rangers had questioned all of Schumacher's friends and neighbors. No one could understand who could rape and murder such a sweet old woman. But eventually, 3 names came up of men who, for one reason or another, were considered suspicious by their neighbors. Detectives asked the men if they'd be willing to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought into the station, hooked up to the machine, and asked point blank if they murdered Schumacher or had any knowledge of the murder. Texas Ranger Bob Cannell was in charge of the case.
We had several suspects in the course of the investigation. One of them was a next-door neighbor. Another one was a person who was later picked up for indecent exposure.
2 men were questioned and released. The third suspect was a young man named Charles Supak, Jr. Supak and his father had actually been doing some work at the Schumacher house on the day she was murdered. A background check revealed he'd once been charged with sexual assault. He was subjected to a thorough interrogation about the crime, but he denied any involvement whatsoever. The polygraph confirmed that Supak was telling the truth.
No, sir.
All 3 suspects had passed the test, and Rangers were now left empty-handed. With no more leads, all they could do was hope to make the best of what they had so far.
Pretty good.
At the crime lab in Austin, Donna Stanley and her colleagues ran tests on the biological evidence left by the rapist.
Characteristics in the hair that I feel very.
Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it to hair samples taken from the 3 suspects.
The medullary structure, the cuticle.
Out of the 3 suspects that I tested, 2 of them were immediately eliminated. The third remained as an inclusion in the blood typing test, and that was Supak. He was not eliminated on ABO typing.
In 1988, ABO blood typing narrowed down evidence to one of only 8 blood types. But with hundreds of millions of people sharing Supak's type, the test results were hardly enough to prove anything. Still, it was all they had to work with, so Rangers brought Supak in again. He had passed the first polygraph test, but investigators were confident that if he were guilty, Supak couldn't beat the machine twice in a row. They decided to try again. It wasn't difficult finding him. He was sitting in jail for possession of marijuana. Rangers felt that if he'd been under the influence of drugs during the first test, he could have possibly lied and still passed.
On the second go-round, he had been in jail for several days, and we knew that he had to be clean at that time. So we took him back for the second polygraph to the same operator, and he passed that one too.
No other evidence was found that could pin the murder on Supak. Authorities had no choice but to clear him of the charges. For nearly a year, Rangers struggled to find Schumacher's killer, but it was hopeless. On November 29, 1988, they finally had to suspend the case. A rapist and murderer roamed somewhere in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Rangers were powerless to stop him. It had been 3 years since Lydia Schumacher was brutally raped and murdered. The only suspect was cleared of all responsibility, and the case sat on the shelf collecting dust. But by 1991, science had advanced enough to warrant another look at the case. Serologist Donna Stanley from the Texas Ranger Crime Lab felt that the new technologies held promise.
We still had a little bit of evidence left, kind of hanging on to it, hoping that as a new technology came along, we might then be able to apply this evidence to that new technology and gain, yet again, some more information. I need to pull that file for some new
The first comparisons made between suspect Charles Supak's hair and body fluids found at the crime scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had done all they could do. But since the initial investigation, a revolutionary new method for analyzing DNA had been developed. Called PCR, it enables scientists to get DNA from tiny samples, like a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something they could never do before. Stanley was optimistic that the evidence collected from the Schumacher house 3 years earlier could finally be used to nail the killer.
Okay, see you around.
Shortly after the case had closed, Sheriff Cannell had retired, and Texas Ranger Ray Kaufman took his place. Kaufman approved further investigation of the evidence and quickly reopened the file.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob. I need something.
At the time I got involved in the Schupak murder, I knew that DNA was making giant leaps in their ability to narrow down suspects, and I felt that this case was one that possibly DNA could help solve.
As the preserved evidence was sent to a genetics lab, Rangers began questioning neighbors and relatives again, hoping to uncover more information about Charles Supak. They soon learned things about their suspect they'd never heard before. Shocking facts that made authorities only more suspicious than ever. Neighbors confided that Supak had quite a disturbing reputation. It was widely reported that he had unusual sex habits, including bestiality. But the most helpful information came from a man who recalled a strange and frightening night with Charles Supak. About 4 months after the murder, John Golson was awakened late one night by Charles Supak. He told Golson that he'd had car trouble and needed help. But something about Supak's manner didn't seem right. John reluctantly agreed to drive him back to his car.
Where are we going? Man, just going out this way.
While they drove around aimlessly, trying to find the car, Golson's suspicions slowly turned to fear. Supak had insisted on sitting directly behind Golson and spent the entire drive idly wrapping an electrical cord around his hands.
No, I don't think so.
Supak finally directed Golson to a remote area, but when they arrived, his vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Tired of the whole affair, Golson finally drove him to a garage.
Back over there behind the tree line.
When Golson got home, he still felt uneasy. He and his wife inspected the grounds and found that their phone lines had been cut. The story took another chilling twist when Golson showed rangers where he'd driven Supak that night. Golson had no idea of the significance of the spot, but its importance didn't escape the rangers. Golson's trip with Supak led rangers to believe that their old suspect knew more about the Schumacher murder than he'd admitted.
Right up over here past the tree line, but we'll have to get you out and walk.
This is the final location where Mr. Schupak brought Mr. Golson that night. Schupak said he'd parked his vehicle down or got it stuck down here by this tree line. This little lane here goes down to the Shoemaker residence. It's maybe a quarter of a mile right down here.
Supak had returned to the Schumacher estate. Rangers knew it was common for a killer to revisit the crime scene, but it would take more than this circumstantial evidence to put the finger on Charles Supak. The lab had run complex DNA tests, comparing Supak's sample to the evidence from the Schumacher case. Finally, on March 8, 1992, the results came in. The DNA of Charles Supak Jr. was in the victim's bed sheets. The updated information finally gave Texas Rangers the evidence they needed to arrest the man they'd suspected for over 5 years. Once again, he was in another Texas county jail for vehicle theft. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Supak admitted to raping and murdering Lydia Schumacher. In his confession, Supak told Rangers that on January 20th, 1988, he and his father had finished some work they'd been doing around Mrs. Schumacher's house and were ready to call it a day. They'd spent nearly a week on the property, and Charles had been inside the house enough to know that Mrs. Schumacher owned some gold jewelry. He figured there had to be more valuables somewhere in the house. That night, Supak returned. He claimed he'd been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of Mrs. Schumacher. Her house was terribly secluded, and she was elderly and defenseless. The house was quiet when he arrived, and getting in was easy. He'd left a pipe in the yard that day. Now it was the perfect tool, and soon it would be the perfect weapon. Once inside, the prowler had a look around. He snuck into her bedroom and began rifling through her things when she awoke. Supak reacted by beating her in the head with the pipe. Before he left, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. It took nearly 5 years, but Charles Supak Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of Lydia Schumacher. The conviction was a tribute to Ranger tenacity, as much as it was a victory of hard science.
Forensic science basically solved this case. If it hadn't been for the advances in DNA, I'm sure this would still be a pending case that would go unsolved.
It's easier to catch a killer, even years after his crime, if he stays put.
If you liked this video, you will surely like the video below. Or click the playlist to see all collection of related videos. And don't forget to subscribe. And click the bell icon to be notified when new videos arrive.